am thrilled to be here today. So excited tonight. And again, if it's last minute for you, been thinking about kids ministry, I like to be very plain spoken. We are not unique. Kids ministry is I believe, most important thing we do on Sunday mornings. I really do that. And for this church and every church, it's always the hardest to find people to do because many of you are just terrified. You're going to get tied to a chair, thrown out to the wolves, beaten. That happens once a month tops. So the odds are in your favor that won't happen. And kidding, of course, it's really wonderful. I've been able to be back there from time to time. And it's just neat to see our kids and to see people that just provide them an environment where the most important thing, they rarely remember, right, what we teach. They remember that we were there. They remember that we love them, that we care about them. So if you're thinking, I wouldn't mind getting in on that tonight, please come. We're going to have plenty of food, plenty of just time to hang out and have a great time for a beautiful summer evening. So I hope you might be able to make it. But we are going to dive back in, as Matt said, to this series. I'm actually going to cover a lot more ground today. If you remember, I lost a couple of weeks back due to my second bout with COVID, and I want to keep us going through the summer, but I actually feel that this will come together as we handle 2 chapters today. Now, first, I'm going to alienate everybody under 40 that won't know who this woman is. So insert your favorite comedian, whoever that is, that you like to watch when you put on a Netflix stand-up special. This is a woman that I grew up with. Some of you will remember her name was Joan Rivers. She passed away several years ago. This is something she said about comedy that I read recently that really struck me. She said, part of my act is meant to shake you up. It looks like I'm being funny, but I'm reminding you of other things. Life is tough, darling. Life is hard, and we better laugh at everything. Otherwise, we're going down the tube, right? And that's why so many of us love comedians, right? Because for 60 minutes, 90 minutes, you laugh. You're with your friends, family, you're enjoying life. And maybe some of those burdens and some of those struggles that are keeping you up at night, they don't disappear, but they get put on the back burner for a little while. That seemed a very appropriate quote for where we find ourselves in this summer journey we're taking through this provocative little book that is, I think, unlike any of the rest of the books in the Bible. There's 66 books total, and this one is a real standout. There's no book quite like this that looks at life and doesn't flinch, says things that most of us think but rarely feel like we have permission, particularly in the church, to ever say, and he says it. So let me tell you, I want to give you a little map today just to tell you where we're going to go. This isn't going to be an extra long message, I assure you of that. We're going to cover 2 chapters, and I think what holds them together is the beginning is what I would call the rat race, which is a mixture of life in this world that's based on injustice and the engine, which I think is envy. What keeps people going? What motivates so many people to find meaning? It's to get ahead of other people. That seems to be the beginning and the end of this section. And I'm going to start there, and then I'm going to zero in, working kind of third down to the 2 things in the middle. I would call this message Shelter from the Storm. Life is hard, darling, as Joan Rivers once said. So we better laugh, but we better find an oasis. We better find a shelter. We better find a place that we can endure the storm. So here we go. Let's see how the writer continues his musing today. We'll go right to chapter 4. He says, again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed. And they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors, there was power, right? This is just age-old struggle. The people that have power are oppressing the people that don't. That's not new. That's not novel. That's not something that's just emerged in the last century or so. This has been going on from the beginning of human history. And there was no one to comfort them. And I thought, notice this depressing note we ended on last week, I thought the dead who are already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. I actually know a couple that I love very, very much, who have told me several times in the years that I've known them that the reason that they decided intentionally not to have children is they would resonate with this. They don't want to bring children into this world. They've said this, and they've told me this. And they haven't said it judgmentally to me. They know I have 4 of them, right? And I disagree with them, but I understand why they feel the way they feel. And the writer here is expressing, the world is hard. There's so much evil. There's so much oppression. There's so much pain. Why would you ever bring a child into that? And notice the sentiment, would be better. This is how the Kohelet, the speaker, feels. Would be better that they never laid eyes on it in the first place, all right? Now, I just want to land us a little bit. God is very clear on how he feels about injustice. There's no mystery about it. Some things in life, I will be the first to admit, man, I don't know if God's really spoken on that clearly, right? There's some gray area. We don't know. You might get an idea here. There is zero gray area on the subject of oppression. Let me just give you 2 from Old Testament books. The first is the book of Leviticus. The nation of Israel is commanded, you shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. In other words, you pay the person right away. You honor the person that has served you. Those with power don't exploit and manipulate those under them just because they can. Let me give you another verse from Zechariah. Do not oppress the widow. Notice the category here. The widow, the fatherless, or the orphan. The sojourner, that's the refugee. The poor, and let none of you devise evil against another in your heart. God stands against oppression. Right? Now that might, I'll tell you what the mystery is, but why is there so much of it if God is opposed to it? Right? That seems to be the unspoken riddle in the heart of the speaker here. There's just so much misery. There's so much abuse of power. There's so much pain. There's so many people suffering, and it'd be better, Kohelet thinks, if this person would never be born to see it. So let's see how he continues from that not so encouraging thought. Ecclesiastes 4, then I saw all the toil and all skill and all work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and striving after the wind. I'm going to leave this up here for just a moment. This is interesting. This man, who I keep calling Kohelet, if you're new, that's the name of the speaker in the book of Ecclesiastes. He's not the author. He's not the one framing this, but the framer, the author, is letting this person speak for a long time, 11 full chapters. And then he's going to comment on it on the end. But he looks at the world. He's an observer, a philosopher, if you will. He's a social commentator. And he says, I'll tell you what the problem is. Everybody is out to get ahead of everybody else. Let that sit with you for a moment. I love summer except for one thing. I am exposed every summer because every neighbor I have is good at lawn care. Every single one. There's not one loser neighbor. I just want one. I just want to drive down Trudeau Drive and see one house where I'm like, that's my kind of guy right there. He's inside watching Stranger Things in the finale, and he's not so worried about what's happening in the front yard or the backyard, right? And Lisa would come out and say, boy, did you see what Mike next door did? I did, honey, I did. But the good thing is she knows not only am I not willing, but I'm also incompetent. So that helps. When you're incompetent, you sort of, that sort of helps you a little bit in these cases. But if I were competent, I'd be in big, big trouble, right? I feel it. I really do. I feel it sometimes. Man, wouldn't it be great if I had the best house on the block? Wouldn't it be great if our lights at Christmas looked better than anybody else? Little, stupid, trivial things, but it's real. You feel it, right? And I remember when Lisa and I got our first home. We got our first townhome down in Halethorpe, Maryland, back in 98. And I felt really, really good about it. First time we owned a home, and, you know, it just looked nice, and I felt good about it. And then my brother bought a house 6 months later, and I hated him because I went to his house in Westminster, and it was beautiful, and it was bigger, and it was better, right? You just feel that. I'm not telling you, by the way, something before my turn to Christ where all those things magically disappear and you don't care. No, I had been following Jesus for years, and I still cared. Because there is in the heart of all of us at some level this desire to get ahead of everybody else. We often don't like to acknowledge it. This might be a good moment to acknowledge it. Envy. But he says, if it's all based on envy, all the great monuments, all the great literature, all the great music, if it's just based on outdoing somebody else, what's the point of it all? It's vanity, it's hevel, it's smoke, it's mist. Now, here he starts getting into some proverbs. The answer, I think, to this is not what he says next, because you could choose the work of the fool. I just won't do anything. It doesn't matter then. And this is kind of a play on words here in the original. The one who folds his hands, the implication is all he has to eat is his hands, because he won't do any work. Right? So you could look at it and say, well, it's all meaningless. So just do nothing. And then he says, better is a handful of quietness, which seems to be inner contentment, than 2 handfuls of toil and a striving after the wind. That's very important for what he's going to say about living in a cruel, chaotic, unjust world. If you can find some quietness, which seems to be some inner contentment in whatever work you do, not like the fool who gives up, but not the overly driven, super ambitious person who is trying to outdo everyone else. Just want to track with the logic here. Let's keep going. Verse 7. Again, I saw vanity under the sun. One person has no other. It's an interesting way to put it. There's no other in his life. Either a son or a brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and unhappy business. This just, to me, makes me always think, every Christmas we watch some version of A Christmas Carol. And I'm always fascinated by the intriguing Ebenezer Scrooge, right, who has money. But you ever notice in every portrayal, he's not living in the lap of luxury. He's just living like a Spartan. It's miserable. He's motivated by earning, making more, but there's no enjoyment of it. There's no one to share it with because he's been such a miser. He's been such a narcissistic individual that there's nobody he shares it with. This is a depressing picture, right? That's how he starts chapter 4. I want to jump to chapter 5 because we're going to come back to some of this good stuff in the middle, but I want you to see how he continues. If you see in a province the oppression of the poor, see how he won't let this go, and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter, for the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivating fields. This is just another observation that he has, right? That there's always somebody above somebody else, but the key in this world is power. Find somebody weaker and oppress them. That seems to be what is capturing his attention. Just continues to ponder the world and says, man, it's people out for themselves, trying to get ahead of everyone else at all costs. Let's keep going. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. We have so many stories of this. People that chase after the almighty dollar and are miserable people. You ever see one of those specials about people that win the lottery? Now, I'm always willing to prove myself to be the exception every time I see these stories, but there must be something to it, because again, this person won $50 million, this person won $100 million, and their life falls apart. They're miserable, they're depressed, they're exploited by family members and friends, right? We see this again and again, people that have all the money in the world but are absolutely miserable. This is also vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? And then notice he says, sweet is the sleep of a laborer. just a regular 9-to-5 guy, the lunch pail guy. Sweet is his sleep, whether he eats little or much. But the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. He seems to be hinting at worry-infused indigestion. It's interesting, isn't it? You've got so many plates spinning. You've got so much in your empire to control that, oh, look at what I've accomplished, but you can't even sleep at night because your heartburn is rising. You can't eat enough Tums in the universe to kind of keep this at bay. This is a picture that he sees. It's dark. It's bleak. Let's keep going. We're almost done this hard section. There's a grievous evil that I've seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. So he sees the person, right? He's got all the money in the world, and then he blows it on a bad venture. And he's a father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again, naked as he came, and he shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? And notice this last statement. Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, in much vexation and sickness and anger. This is the path he sees of the person that tries to pursue worldly power, worldly riches, worldly success. Is that, you ever seen that in a high school yearbook? Most likely to eat in darkness, in much vexation, sickness, and anger. I mean, you don't see that. And most likely to succeed, most likely to be a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. But Kohelet sees something different. What's the point of all of it? It's miserable. But then he starts to pivot a little bit and thinks, what can we do to insulate ourselves from such a dog-eat-dog, unjust world? Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting, and he says this a lot, is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil. This is the gift of God, for he will not much remember the days of his life, because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. Now it's interesting. This, if you've paid attention to the series, Kohelet says this again and again. I think he's right, but I don't think he's right enough. Now again, if that makes you nervous, it's great contradicting the Bible. I don't think this speaker has the final word. I just want to keep saying that. We got to wait till Labor Day weekend and get to chapter 12. And that's when I think the true author of the book comes out and says, now that you heard Kohelet, let me say a couple of things to put it all in perspective. So it's hard to do a series like this. I just want to pause right now and say, he seems to be onto something here. In a brutal, difficult world, find the moments that you can. And there's a lot of truth in that, right? Well, not all of us. 5 of the 6 Dutchers yesterday spent time with good friends at the Orioles game. Win number 7. Yeah, come on, let's keep it going. Let's get number 8 today, right? It's fun. It was a 1-0 game. It was like watching a soccer game. But I didn't want to, bang my head against the wall because it wasn't soccer, so that was good. And we had a great time with good friends. Wasn't a life-changing moment, but it was one of those kind of stolen moments. It's good to be with family. It's good to be with friends. It's good to have a good experience, right? That seems to be what he's suggesting. I guess that's the best we can do. Interestingly enough, though, Kohelet, sandwiched in this section, says some other things that I don't think he extrapolates quite enough. It's fascinating to me. Let me take you back into the sections we've missed so far, because he deals with worship and community. He says, guard your steps when you go to the house of God. We sang this morning, that song everybody loves. There's joy in the house of the Lord. That's a great song, right? To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. Be not rash with your mouth. Nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few, For a dream comes with much business, and a fool's voice with many words. I'm going to come to that in just a moment. But he kind of in the middle of this chaotic world talks about worship and says, hey, when we worship, have a posture of listening, of receptivity. Come to worship and don't just take the rat race into your worship. You know, the rat race all week is what? Outdoing one another, getting the first word out, being there first, winning. When you go to worship, don't act rashly. Come in and listen. Come in and experience God. The sacrifices, right, which in our context might be singing, talking, sort of the formal aspects of worship. He's not knocking those things. He's saying before those things, it's about the posture of our heart. Right? The prophet Samuel said this in 1 Samuel 15. These are famous words. He said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. The heart that cares about the voice of the Lord is something to think about here, something to cherish in the midst of an unjust world. To find shelter in God's voice. It's interesting that he drops that here. And again, he keeps cautioning about being rash in our worship. Notice what he says next. When you vow a vow to God, you make a promise, in other words, don't delay paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It's better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Let not your mouth lead you into sin. And do not say before the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For when dreams increase and words grow many, there is vanity. But God is the one you must fear. I think what he's talking about here, notice this idea of vanity and dreams. You know, this kind of rat race that we get caught up in and we live leads to a lot of ambition, leads to a lot of hopes. I could get here, I could get there, and then I could kind of go to worship and bring that same attitude in. And he's saying, whoa, slow down. Think about who God is. Think about what he says. Slow down the rat race. Don't act like when you do your business before God that he operates the way the world does. He's not impressed with slick talking words. He's not impressed with religious maneuvers. He's not impressed with outdoing other people around you. He notices the humble heart, the receptive posture of the worshiper. Jesus actually quotes Isaiah to castigate the zealous religious performers in his day. Look what he says in Matthew 15. You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. I think that's what Kohelet is saying here. When we go to worship the Lord in this chaotic world, don't make it just another form of how the world operates. Bring in a receptive heart, a posture to care deeply what God is saying to you, what he's communicating to you when you're in his presence. Now, I'm working backwards here. That's the first thing that he mentions. But he also seems to talk about the need for community. Now, I'm going to give you this little bizarre story he tells very quickly in the middle of this to describe a king who you would think would be on top of the world. He actually talks about two kings. Look what he says in chapter 4. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. So here's a king. He's on top of the world. He's got everything you could ever imagine. Just doesn't listen to anybody. Has no interest in the counsel of other people. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been poor. Now, what seems to be happening here is we've got two kings. You've got the first king who is the one who won't listen, and then you've got this king who might be in the image of Joseph, an Old Testament figure who starts in the prison and ends up in a kingly role. I don't know. Some people suggest it. But notice what he says about either king. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people, of all whom he led. Yet those who came later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a striving after the wind. This is fascinating to me. He seems to suggest that there's two kings, and neither of them ultimately matter. Why? Because nobody cares when they're gone. Why is he telling this story here? Because I think a king represents, right, the brass ring. This is what all of us would ultimately want. Total success in our careers, in our monetary goals, in our life goals. You're a king, you're at the top of the heap, right? He says, it doesn't matter. And I think it's because he said something just before this. Famous verse, maybe one of the most famous verses in Ecclesiastes section. It's read at a lot of weddings. I just did a wedding a month or two ago where this was a chosen text, beautiful text. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. In other words, when you accomplish something solo, you pat yourself on the back. When you accomplish something with someone, it's a shared experience. Don't you know the difference? For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. And if you're solo and you fall, but woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. Again, if two lie together, they keep warm, right? The most basic kind of human connection you could make. Picture two people out in the cold. The very best thing they could do is to lay close together and share in their own warmth. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will withstand him. And it gets even better if it's three. A threefold cord. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. And Kohelet here seems to look at the world and say, if you want to find shelter from this chaos, there's approaching God with a receptive heart, and there's clinging to one another, right? There's finding comfort in other people. That's how we're designed. Now, I was kind of combing through Twitter this week, and I saw the strangest thing. A family shared some pictures that was captured on their Ring camera. A young girl, I believe a teenager, had a very acute attack of anxiety, fear, depression. And she called her mother at work because she was falling apart. So the mother drives home, and this is the first picture. And there is her daughter in the driveway. It's raining, it's pouring. And she's suffering. Probably a lot of neighbors out there that see this strange thing happening, right? And you put yourself in the position of the mother. That's the second picture. Mom gets out of the car. What do you do there? Option one was, get up, you're embarrassing yourself. Go back in the house, girl. That's one option. Or there's the option she chose, and that's the third picture. Yeah, isn't that good? There she is, laying next to her daughter in the rain. Because that's what we need. That's how we were designed. It doesn't matter what people think about it. Doesn't matter how weak it looks. Doesn't matter if it's socially awkward or uncomfortable. Two are better than one. If one falls down and has no one to pick them up, what they do they do? And I saw this picture and I cried when I saw it on Twitter of all places. I cry at Twitter a lot, but not because of this. And I thought, oh my goodness. It's right here for us. The world is hard. It's so hard. I mean, I wish I could tell my kids, oh, world's not as hard as you get. I just be more, it's hard. It's really hard. By the way, being a Jesus follower doesn't make it easier. In some ways, it makes it even harder. But I can say this, we can, in this hard, crazy world, I think, find shelter in two things. We can bring our hearts open before God and let him speak to us. And we can confess our need, that we need each other. We need people that'll lay with us in the rain. and be there for us in our time of need. So I'm going to give the takeaway in 2 more verses. Takeaway today, I just wanted to make simple is, yes, life is often unfair. It's hard. So let's cling to God's word, what he says to us, and each other. But here's where the gospel, the good news of Jesus, which we find as our bedrock here at CFC, this is where it really speaks, because you know what Jesus is? He's the embodiment of those 2 things, isn't he? He is God's word to us, and he is the friend who will lay with us in the rain. He is the one who will embrace us. He is the one that the big, strong, tough CEO can say, I'm just lost. He's the one that the drug addict can say, I just don't know what to do. He's the one the person dealing with depression and anxiety, which is a real thing, by the way, can say, I need you to embrace me when I can't fix myself. Jesus is the embodiment of those 2 things. Now, Kohelet lived hundreds of years before Jesus came, but we get to look back on it and say, oh, what he's hinting at is found fulfilled perfectly in Jesus. Let me show you that in 2 places in the New Testament. One, Hebrews chapter 1. Long ago, at many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers through the prophets. And that's so many people, right? It's Isaiah, it's Ezekiel, it's Moses, Samuel, it's Micah, it's Zechariah. There's so many. But in these last days, this is the final word. He's spoken to us by his son. So when Jesus speaks, we get all of God's heart towards us. But we also find in Jesus not just the word of God, but the embrace of God. Look at John 15. No longer, he says, do I call you servants. For the servant doesn't know what his master is doing. He's just a servant, right? But I've called you friends, for I've made known to you all that I've heard from my Father. And he's not ashamed to call us friends. 2 is better than 1. Threefold cord is not quickly broken. And Jesus embraces us. So may I just urge you, if you find the world hard, God is speaking to you, I believe, through his word today, saying, yes, I know that. And I think he wants you to point you to his word to you and his embrace of you, both found in his son, Jesus. Let me pray for you, Lord. Hard passages today. Uncomfortable thoughts when the veil is just pulled back a little bit on this world and we see its ugliness, we see its self-centeredness, we see its, at times, just unchecked raw ambition that would steamroll us if we're in the way. Lord, that's not going away. We can't make that disappear. But Lord, would you lead us to the shelter in the midst of that storm? There is chaos, Lord, all around us, but there is such a beautiful, firm foundation in Jesus. May we run to him and find shelter in the storm. In his name we pray. Amen.